Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the National Press Club, the place where news happens for our Headliners Newsmaker. I'm Mike Balsamo, treasurer of the National Press Club and national law enforcement editor at the Associated Press. Former Arkansas Governor Asa Hutchinson launched his presidential campaign this past fall in front of the Benton County Courthouse in Bentonville, Arkansas, the same spot where in 1986 he launched his first campaign for public office. A long shot and ultimately unsuccessful bid to unseat Senator Dale Bumpers, a Democrat. 10 years later, he was back, this time as U.S. Representative Asa Hutchinson, succeeding his brother Tim Hutchinson after capturing 56% of the vote in the Northwest Arkansas district that included Bentonville. In 2006, he lost the race for governor of Arkansas to then Attorney General Mike Beebe, a Democrat, only to return in 2014 and win the general election with a decisive 55% of the vote, the largest margin for a Republican in an open seat gubernatorial race since Reconstruction. He won re-election in 2018. Governor Hutchinson, it seems, is no stranger to long shot campaigns. Today, despite poll numbers that place him at near the bottom of a crowded Republican field and fundraising that may exclude him from the first Republican debate in August, Governor Hutchinson has persevered. This weekend, he even weathered boos and jeers from Trump supporters at the Turning Point USA conference in West Palm Beach, Florida. Governor Hutchinson characterizes himself as a consistent conservative with decades of experience in the public service and elective office. He has not let up on his criticism of former President Donald Trump, despite the backlash, and has said that Trump's role in the 2021 insurrection at the U.S. Capitol should disqualify him from holding office. Today, we look forward to hearing more about the first plank of Governor Hutchinson's presidential policy agenda, a proposal for a complete reform of federal law enforcement. Please join me in giving a warm National Press Club welcome to Governor Asa Hutchinson.
Mike, you can always count the press to put a dose of realism into an introduction. So thank you for that. And of course, I'll overlay realism with a lot of optimism as I continue the campaign. I want to thank the National Press Club for opening up this venue to make this important announcement on the future of federal law enforcement and the reform that is so needed today. And whenever you look at the rule of law, and of course we're here celebrating the freedom of the press, but the freedom of the press would really be meaningless if we did not have the rule of law. There's a lot of countries that recite in their constitutions freedom of the press, but it's nothing but empty paper because they have no access to courts. They have no access to enforce it. And so the freedom of the press and all of our freedoms are so intertwined with the rule of law. And this is personal to me. This is representing what I have advocated for throughout my public career and in my private life as well. I'm an attorney, but I'm also a federal prosecutor. I have been a city prosecutor. I have been head of the DEA. I was in Homeland Security, overseeing one of the largest federal law enforcement agencies. I have been a defense attorney in the courtroom. While I was in Congress, I was on the Judiciary Committee overseeing many of the federal agencies that are involved here. And so I bring a breadth of experience, but I hope you see a breadth of commitment in my life to our system of justice that is second to none in our world today. And I'm proud of the system of justice in America. I'm proud of the rule of law that we have, and I don't want to see it undermined. I don't want to see it fail in its really premier responsibility of creating a system of laws in our country. And of course, when I reflect back, I was a young United States attorney when Ronald Reagan was president. And two historic moments. One was when Ronald Reagan, trying to enhance the war on drugs, said he's going to bring in the FBI and give them jurisdiction over drug cases. That was in the early 1980s, while I was a young United States attorney. And that was a historic transformational moment for the FBI, giving them that added jurisdiction. Fast forward another 20 years, while I'm in another historic position, and that is whenever I'm called in on a Sunday to the operations room at the Department of Justice, where I'm head of the DEA. We have Director Mueller there. We had the Department of Justice leadership. Attorney General John Ashcroft comes back from the White House, and he announces it is no longer enough for the FBI and federal law enforcement to prosecute terrorists or to prosecute crime. We have to be in the preventive business. And at that moment, the mission of the FBI changed rather dramatically in order to gather intelligence and to prevent a terrorist attack and to elevate their counterterrorism mission. And so I've seen two very historic moments in law enforcement history at the federal level, both with the 1980 change of President Reagan and with the change made by President Bush. I saw it live and in person. Well, today we're 20 years advanced from those historic moments. And today I am offering another historic moment to reform federal law enforcement, to correct some errors, some omissions, to correct some change in the climate of crime in our country. And so I've been fighting my entire adult life for justice. I want to continue to do that. And whenever we see the needs, I'm calling for a new direction, and I'm calling for reform of the FBI that provides more focus, more accountability, and a deeper commitment to civil liberties. And the reform that I'm calling for today does not just apply to the FBI, but to all of federal law enforcement. And I want to first say that I have worked closely, extremely closely, with some of the top FBI officials in our country that are dedicated to the rule of law, to fairness, and to public safety. They're fine individuals, and so I've always had praise for our federal law enforcement partners, both in terms of personal relationships and their professional responsibilities. But I believe that Donald Trump has done great harm to our rule of law in this country and to federal law enforcement. He has undermined their credibility in the eyes of the public. He has continued his victimization, and it has harmed our support for law enforcement and the confidence that Americans need to have in the criminal justice system. And because of that, even though some of his claims are justified, going back to 2016, but they have become self-serving, and they have undermined exactly what we're trying to accomplish in this country, which is a rule of law that works, a criminal justice system that is equal in its treatment of all individuals, and that has the confidence of the public. And that has been our system of justice all through history, and we want it to continue, but we need to have reform to make sure it works well. There are currently, and I'll make the case for reform, there are over 90 federal law enforcement agencies with authority to carry firearms and authority to make arrests. The investigative authority includes every agency from the Secret Service, postal fraud under the U.S. Postal Service, National Park Service officers for violation of the National Park rules, for federal protective services that guards our buildings, to the Department of Agriculture that investigates food stamp fraud and other things. The jurisdiction for offenses is not always clear, and this leads to turf wars. It leads to confusion and lack of efficiency and effectiveness in the work of our federal law enforcement agencies. The FBI is the only law enforcement agency with exclusive jurisdiction over all federal crimes. The result is too much time on turf battles within the agencies and too many agents, officers that are going to a simple case because they have overlapping jurisdiction. And this can, over time, impact the clarity of the mission and the work on important cases that impact national security and public safety. The clearest example of the duplicative efforts in federal enforcement is in the area of illegal drugs. We have the DEA, the FBI, and ICE that have specific statutory jurisdiction over federal drug laws and violations. And of course, illegal drugs can be encountered in any venue from national parks to federal buildings, and so there's naturally some overlap. But the coordination is critical, and the clarity of mission of our law enforcement agencies is absolutely essential. And so the most recent controversies with the FBI and some of the other federal agencies are for shadow banning, in which the Louisiana federal judge raised an issue of federal agents going into social media companies and alerting them to problems on accounts that results in account being canceled. And that, of course, is on appeal at the present time, but it raises a significant issue that our reform addresses as well. There's important principles at stake. One, the rule of law is fundamental to our democracy. Secondly, our federal agents, including the FBI, are fighting a battle for public safety and our security that is critical, and they are to be praised for their efforts. The third principle is that defunding the FBI is off the charts bad idea, and anyone who makes that argument is ignoring reality and weakens our law enforcement. And finally, as I've made the case, there are needs for reform. The reform centers around accountability for enforcement actions. It is critical that we protect civil liberties. We have to have clarity and focus of mission, and that we have to have fiscal responsibility even in the operation of federal law enforcement. And which I'll just emphasize that every local prosecutor has resource constraints. Well, that was the problem with an independent counsel. There was no resource constraints which allowed them to go after and target individuals. There always should be some fiscal discipline and constraints that may help guide our federal law enforcement as well. And so with that, I wanted to go through 8 particular elements of reform that are critical for today. And if you will look at this, I think you can conclude that this is the boldest set of reform ideas in federal law enforcement in my lifetime. And first of all, as I've set the stage for it, our plan would be to take federal enforcement of our drug, narcotic offenses away from the FBI and to give them jurisdiction over everything else. But it would allow them to continue to concentrate on their counterterrorism mission, their violent crime initiatives, and be more focused as an agency. And so there still would be, when you're looking at the fentanyl crisis, for example, we have the DEA, we have ICE, we have Customs, that all will be engaged in this effort. If it comes to terrorism that is supported by drugs or organized crime, there's obviously some overlap. DEA has the lead when it comes to the drug mission. They will lead that effort, and we will minimize the role of the FBI in terms of drug enforcement because we want them to focus on their other critical missions. Secondly, it is critical that we hold the FBI accountable for the protection of privacy and civil liberties. Right now, there's the Office of Privacy and Civil Liberties within the FBI, but it is housed underneath the General Counsel's office. That needs to be elevated to give it more stroke, to give it more independence. It should report directly to the Director's office. Secondly, when it comes to shadow banning, there has to be transparency. And this is broader than just the FBI. If you're looking at a government agency that goes to a bank and says, you need to look at this account and perhaps you ought to close it out because we have information on them, that's a property interest. That is something that is important to some citizen of the United States. And there ought to be some level of transparency. And I would suggest that that transparency would be to report that type of conduct of shadow banning to congressional committees and to the Congressional Advisory Board that would be set up under my plan. This would be helpful in simply allowing transparency. It could be through the Privacy and Civil Liberties Board that is doing good work that's out there. It can also be to congressional committees, the Gang of 8, in which they would review from an intelligence standpoint exactly what the FBI activities are. The third reform is, you might consider in the weeds, but anybody who's practiced law in federal court understands this. And that is to increase the transparency and accountability of the FBI by recording interviews. If you look at local law enforcement, if they interview a subject or a witness, it is normally the rule that it would be recorded. And when you go into court, there's a recording that you can have that as the best evidence. The FBI has always had a different rule, and the general rule is that no recordings. The FBI agent takes the notes, they're later recorded on a 302, and that summary of the interview is what that agent relies upon a year, 2 years later as they go into court. There's no recording. That is the general rule of the FBI. I want to reverse the general rule so that the general rule is recording of witness and subject interviews. And the exception would be those unique circumstances for national security reason or some approval process through a high level in the FBI that you can have an exception. The general rule, though, would be to record interviews. By the way, just as a side note there, if you look at the indictment of the classified information on former President Trump, you will see that the interview of one of the witnesses was actually recorded. That's the way it should be. Let's move on here. Fourth, we need to reassign FBI administrative support offices. Right now, you have the FBI as in all practical matters, an independent body, even independent of the Justice Department. I think they've made some progress for merging those to a greater extent, but the Justice Department needs to be more intertwined with the FBI, where the FBI has actual supervision over an Attorney General that's been appointed by the President of the United States that has a higher level of accountability. And so the support role can be moved over to the Department of Justice, and that would intertwine those agencies to a greater extent. Sure, the FBI is going to continue to have a congressional relations office because Congress wants to be able to have that. But they need to report up the chain to the Department of Justice where there will be transparency and clarity as to what the position of the Department of Justice is. The fifth reform is to establish a charter for federal law enforcement agencies. This applies across the board. This will be a unified framework where there's fundamental principles set forth in each federal law enforcement agencies about protection of civil liberties, about enhancing accountability, and this will ensure consistency across our federal agencies. Sure, they will have unique missions, but they will have a uniform charter that will assure that we're not going to target someone because of political speech. We're not going to target someone because they're exercising a fundamental constitutional right. And those should be described and set forth in a charter document. And then sixth, looks more at the future and a comprehensive plan. And that is to establish a commission on the future of federal law enforcement, where there can be a more in-depth study as to where there is overlap, where we can achieve more efficiencies, where we can define jurisdictions more clearly, and where there's a challenge that we can meet that with a legislative fix. And so that commission will look at it from a much broader scale into the future for efficiencies, effectiveness, and for public safety and the protection of civil liberties. Then the seventh point is that we need to reform the intelligence collection under Section 702 of FISA. This is our foreign intelligence collections. It has been misused in the past, primarily because we have agents that query it without responsibility, without authority, and without good reason and cause to do so. That needs to be changed. We need to continue Section 702 and have it renewed, but we also need to make changes to have appropriate congressional review and to reform and prevent abuses. Any inquiry into the Section 702 database should be reported to Congress, to the Gang of Eight, to our intelligence committees, so that there is some awareness and checks and balances in something that is so sensitive that could impact our U.S. citizens. And then finally, it's critically important that we reaffirm the critical relationship between the President and the Attorney General. And yes, in the post-Watergate era, we've had more of an independent Department of Justice, Attorney General, particularly in the area of investigations. Policy has to be intertwined. There are certain unique cases that have to be communicated, but in the general context, it is critically important that we maintain the independence of the investigation and the authority of the Department of Justice. And so thank you for allowing me to present these reform proposals that are designed to improve the rule of law in our country, designed to build confidence of our citizens in our system of justice that is fundamental to everything that we want to accomplish in maintaining our freedoms. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Let me just remind the audience that I'm happy to take your questions. Please write them legibly on the cards and pass them up to Kate Helster or Donna Lanwan-Leger here at the front of the room. So, Governor, I was hoping we could start, with one of your proposals here. So, there's obviously public confidence has lowered in the FBI in the recent years, as has morale within the Bureau. How would you take that into account? How do you get the Bureau to a place where the public is, more of the public is confident in the ability of the agents who are working there and in the work that is done in the FBI?
Well, you do that by having balance in the reform proposals, and that's why I hope all the FBI agents that are out there in the field see this as giving them a more focused mission, to give them more transparency, to give them more credibility in the courtroom. Whenever they testify, it's not just going to be based upon simple note-taking that could be based upon human error, but you're going to have a recording in most instances to support their testimony. And so that transparency, this should build confidence in the FBI and their work. Everything that we do in our government has checks and balances. Whenever you look at the most sensitive thing, which is collecting intelligence information, there has to be guardrails. And so I see this as a morale boost for the FBI. I see this as a confidence builder for the public toward the FBI.
Do you support the use of body-worn cameras for FBI agents conducting field interviews or during search warrants that are executed by the Bureau?
A great question, and in the normal course of FBI activities, no, I don't see any need for that. Generally, the reason you have the body cameras is whenever you're in a potential dangerous or confrontation with a citizen in which harm could come. It's a protective measure for the police as well as information for the public. But no, I don't see that necessary in routine FBI actions. Obviously, if you have like the FBI and the hostage rescue team negotiating with the covenant of the sword and arm of the Lord, this is a potential confrontation that was in Arkansas that I was U.S. Attorney on. Sure, in this day and time, I think there ought to be as much documentation of that type of potential violent outcome as we can have.
How do you get other Republicans, including those who, have disparaged federal law enforcement officers who have called for defunding the FBI. You know, committees have obviously formed about the weaponization of the federal government. How do you get them on board with your plan to reform federal law enforcement?
Well, there'll be some that say it didn't go far enough, you need to abolish the FBI, and that is just plain wrong. It is, you know, not in the best tradition of my party, where we support the rule of law. We're a party of law and order. And so this is where Donald Trump has done great damage because there's so much sympathy for what happened in 2016, and as the Durham report indicated, there was wrongdoing on the part of the FBI. But then you fast forward that and you overlay that into 2020 and the mishandling of classified information. You know, he has personalized it all, this battle, and that is what has taken it to the extreme among many of the Republican base and created this animosity and distrust that is really not called for, where you need to have reform over a dismantling and destroying the confidence that America traditionally has. Rebuild confidence rather than destroy confidence.
Governor, there have been more than 30 mass killings so far this year, more at this point in the year than any other since at least 2006, according to a USA Today, Northeastern University, and Associated Press database on this. These mass killings have claimed more than 150 lives so far in 2023. How should we be addressing gun violence in this country, and how does that fit into your proposal for reforming federal law enforcement?
Well, you've got to get to the root cause of the gun violence, and it's everything from mental illness to simply a heart that does not regard life. And those are fundamental values that we have to address in our society. And then the second part of it is preventive measures. And we've taken, whether it's a business that wants to protect their customers, you know, you have off-duty police officers, others, you have cameras, so we've built those preventive measures in. Those are two things that are important for us. You know, I applaud Senator Cornyn and you know, his Democrat counterpart that had a bipartisan solution that closed a gap on juvenile records to make sure that we knew if somebody was violent or had a violent record that they're not going to have access to guns when they turn the legal age. And so there's some things that can be done, but focus on prevention, focus on the root cause of our violence.
You mentioned civil liberties. How do you strike the balance between necessary intelligence sharing between agencies, including the CIA, and privacy of private citizens?
Well, we learned from 9/11 and the extraordinary 9/11 Commission report that you have to avoid setting up silos for intelligence sharing. And I actually thought about that because the United States is unique, that you have a domestic law enforcement agency that investigates crime but also gathers intelligence. So it's unusual. And there's thought to, you know, we ought to separate those two. But the lessons of 9/11, I think we need to give it another opportunity to make it work right. And that's where I concentrated on the transparency, the checks and balances, versus rebuilding silos that prevents you know, legitimate law enforcement agencies from having the information they need to have on particular threats. So to me, again, it's the checks and balances, it's the transparency that is most critical.
How does your plan for law enforcement reform set you aside from other candidates running for the GOP nomination? And are you prepared to defend your plan on the debate stage if this time comes?
Absolutely. I'm prepared to defend it. And then secondly, I make the case, and I don't think anybody disputes it, that I have a greater breadth of experience in federal law enforcement than anybody on the stage. I know we've got another former United States attorney there, but I've led the DEA. I have, you know, have a breadth of experience in Homeland Security, which is again another federal law enforcement agencies. So I'm happy to defend the proposal, both with the media and on the debate stage, because it's the right balance for America, and that's a word that probably doesn't sometimes sell that well whenever you're looking at harsh language and getting clicks and who can drum up the latest controversy. But I don't believe in chaos. I believe in doing things the right way. That's what governors do. And this is a plan with balance that has very dramatic reform, but doesn't go crazy, that undermines our public safety, undermines our counterterrorism efforts. So happy to defend it, and I'm sure I'll have that opportunity.
Could you share your thoughts on, the recent talk about reducing the size of FBI headquarters, establishing these larger satellite offices, and most recently, the idea of moving the FBI's headquarters to Alabama?
Great question. And first, I think you ought to give thought to changing the name of the FBI headquarters from the Hoover Building. I think that's reminiscent of a time in FBI history that did not protect civil liberties, did not even have a regard for civil liberties, and it's really an image that you want the FBI to get away from, which, under Chris Wray, they've had some reform, and so I want to applaud him for progress. We just need more progress and more reform. In terms of the location, my view is that every key agency ought to be located in close proximity to the President of the United States, in the sense of the Department of Justice and their relationship with the FBI. Out of sight sometimes is out of mind. And so I want that relationship to be close. And so I do like having many of the sub-agencies out in the field. Would love to have one in Arkansas. And when you're talking about sub-agencies, it could be labs. It could be their forensics. These are things that can be moved out of the headquarters arena and moved out in different parts of the country. And I love that really in many aspects of our federal agencies, but particularly in this regard in the FBI. So let's get it done. Let's have it make sense, and let's move some of those out to where people live. You also mentioned about some of the regional offices. There's a lot of beautiful regional offices that are out there, and a lot of beautiful FBI offices that are in our states, and they need protection. They're could be a target of opportunity, but I think they're well resourced in that regard.
I want to follow up on something that you mentioned there, FBI Director Wray. What are your thoughts on how Director Wray has run the agency, and would you, as president, keep Director Wray on as director of the FBI?
Well, Director Wray ought to be applauded for his patriotism, for his commitment to the rule of law, for his leadership. He's had a very, very tough time. And obviously, under his leadership, there's been mistakes made by the FBI, and he has made some reform efforts that have been helpful. But I would want an FBI agent, I want an FBI director that is fresh, that is committed to the level of reform. What I've outlined here is not easy. I was obviously helped set up the new Department of Homeland Security, the largest government reorganization since the Pentagon was created. And it's not easy transforming government. It's not easy making these changes. And so you've got to have a leadership team that is 100% committed to not the traditional way of doing things necessarily, but the transparency that I've spoken of. So I would want to have new leadership so that we could carry out the reforms that I've talked about.
How do you stop politicians from using their power to trigger what people see as politically motivated criminal investigations?
Using their power to stop?
How do you see stopping?
Of them from doing
Yes.
it, but for impacting politically motivated investigations. Well, first of all, both administrations have been guilty of this, and at different levels. But obviously, whenever you have a President of the United States under the previous administration calling out specific individuals and chewing on the Department of Justice, why haven't you done something on this? Why aren't they in jail yet? And they saying this publicly, that's inappropriate. And you could say the same thing about stopping investigations. And it's a very delicate matter whenever you're in jeopardy, or that investigation impacts your political future. But it's our post-Watergate environment, and it's fundamentally the right thing to do on specific investigations. This current administration under President Biden, is handled in a different way. The most offensive thing was, well, that was actually the previous administration, but the way Jim Comey and the FBI has handled their investigations crossed some lines as well. And so it's about leadership, it's about having the right people in place, and it's about having this transparency.
On one of your tenets of the reform plan talks about having the Attorney General closer to the President or more engaged with the President of the United States. How would you envision an Attorney General striking the right balance between those conversations and making sure that the department maintains its independence and ensuring that there are not politically motivated investigations?
Well, first of all, there has to be clarity from the outset in your relationship with the Attorney General. The Attorney General, with the President, should help set the priorities of the Department of Justice. I remember what the priorities were in previous administrations for violent crime, for white-collar crime, for terrorism, and it all depends upon the challenge of the moment, violent crime. And so the President needs to be engaged because this impacts the entire nation and it sets the tone for the nation. And so setting priorities is right and holding the Department of Justice accountable for it. Whenever you're looking at the efficiencies, whenever you're looking at all the other operations of the Department of Justice, from their handling of grant programs, I want to make sure that our grant programs are going to cities that are enforcing the law, for example. Well, that's a relationship between the President and the Department of Justice. So it's just in the area of, once they started an investigation, that there's always some exceptions of foreign interests that might come to bear in our foreign policy with the President. But by and large, that has to be run by the Department of Justice, the investigative body, free of any influence from the White House.
You've said you would not pardon former President Donald Trump in the Justice Department's investigation into his handling of classified records. Do you stand behind that statement? And could you explain your thinking on why you would not consider a pardon of the former president?
Well, first of all, as a candidate for president, I'll never consider a pardon for anyone. And I'm talking about it in my public statements. It's wrong. You're running as a candidate and you don't bargain pardons and you don't dangle them out there for votes. And so I have great respect for the pardon power. I utilize that as governor of Arkansas. And I accomplished with it mercy in some cases, justice in other cases, and giving people a fresh start in other instances. And I had some guidelines that I followed. And so it's not that never will it ever be considered, because you don't know the outcome of the case in court. But if you start dangling or promising, as some candidates do, I will do this, then why in the world is the jury even called? I mean, why do they have to go through that? You're undermining the jury. And you're going to give those jurors in there, throw up their hands and say, well, why are we even bothering with this? Because you've already seen people promising pardons. And so, again, you've got candidates that are misusing the power of the presidency. You've got candidates that are undermining our rule of law and our justice system. And you've got to let this play out. And then we'll see what happens down the road.
Are you concerned about foreign influence in U.S. elections and the influence of foreign media entities on the electorate?
Yes, I am. Whenever you see the ability of foreign governments to utilize social media to manipulate information that goes to the American public, obviously whenever you have the level of attention that Americans pay to social media, well, that's an avenue that you're going to have foreign influence. And you know, the best anecdote to that is information to the American public versus censorship that can cross over to U.S. citizens. And so it's a challenge for us as a society, and as always, challenges have to be met by our citizens and our voters, and to realize that risk is out there. Whenever we know that there's foreign actors involved, then law enforcement ought to be able to sound the alarm on it, make people aware of that, and also do the appropriate investigation.
I want to turn to a couple of questions related to your campaign. Have any of your former colleagues in Congress been receptive to your campaign, and are you seeking their endorsements?
Yes, and at the right time, yes, on the latter part. Sure, I've got support from former members of Congress. I love the relationship I've had with many of my colleagues, but I also, I don't go and put them on the spot and say, hey, would you endorse me now? I'd like to be a little bit higher in the polls before I make that request. And so I'm very respectful of where they are, and I also know that, you know, I'm fighting in the trenches with the voters, and endorsements help, but they're not the end all. And so I'm proud of the relationship I have with many of my former colleagues and some of the current members as well. And I hope there'll be at the right time that I'll be able to ask them and they'll say yes.
You are still several thousand donors away from meeting the 40,000 minimum to make the debate stage. How do you plan to meet that minimum by August 23rd?
Working hard at getting there. I mean, there's a plan in place. There's a lot of people that are helping us to get to the 40,000 donor threshold. And you know, if you'd have told me when I started this campaign that I would have 100 or 200 or 300, 400 new donors in a single day across the country, I would say that is incredible. But then you realize, you know, to the threshold that's been placed, you know, you have to have thousands every day in order to meet that. So it's a high threshold that's been set. We're going to make that goal, and we have a plan to get there, and we have a lot of people that are helping us. So that's the main mission that I have between now and August 23. And you got to put the time in perspective. We're still in you know, early. We've got time to work with, and we expect to get there.
You spoke this past weekend at the Turning Point USA Action Conference, a conservative organization focused on college campuses by Charlie Kirk that's been stalwart in its support for President Trump. As a vocal critic of the former president, I'm sure you were not surprised to face a sort of hostile crowd there. In fact, you were booed and jeered. Why did you decide to engage with this group? And how do you see resonating with younger audiences, particularly younger Republicans?
Well, I wish you could have been there with the younger audience. And I actually got stuck in the airport trying to get here because of the storms. It took a long time. And so I was in the airport with all of these young people. And we were in line for a long time, taking photographs, having conversations. And that's why I'm there, to engage that generation. And I relate to them, I communicate with them, I understand, but I also listen to them. And so it's a great interchange. Now, you're right, you know, we had some boos out there, and guess what? They were not from the college-age kids. They were from the adults. And so they didn't set the best example. But why I went there, though, was just I said, I'll defend my position in a place that you have an opportunity to make your case. And these are voters that I hope to get down the road. This is the most unpredictable political landscape that I've seen in my lifetime. And if anybody can tell me the outcome next year, make sure you see me afterwards, and we'll put place some bets on that if necessary. But it's an unpredictable environment, and so I see this changing dramatically, and I want to make sure that the Trump voters and others that are going to be voting next year they understand my background, they understand who I am, what makes me tick, and my vision for America. That's why I went there, and that's why I went to other places that are challenging venues, and I've always done that and always will.
Most of the other Republican candidates have avoided direct criticism of former President Trump. Do you believe that the Republican Party is held captive by the former president, and why do you think that you can break through?
Do I think the party is captive? Well, whenever you have 50+% of the vote, it might not be captive, but they certainly have been listening to him, and they have a understanding of him as a former president. How do you break through that? All I can say is you can't hit a home run unless you take a swing at the bat. You know, the last thing I want to do as a batter is to sit there and watch 3 strike balls go across the plate. I'm going to swing at one of them. And whenever you're in a campaign for President of the United States and you announce for president, I was the 3rd one to announce, and I'm saying our country needs an alternative to Donald Trump. I believed it then, I believe it now, and I want to make my case. And whenever I argue to the jury, I give them proof beyond a reasonable doubt. I make my case, and I can go shake hands with the opposing counsel afterwards. So it's not a matter of animosity. It's a matter of making your case for votes. And the only way you can win is through Donald Trump. And particularly whenever you disagree with where he will take this country in the future, and some of the things that he's done in the past, increasing our debt. You know, whenever you look at some of the ways he handled the pandemic, I disagree with those things. I can be a better leader than that. And I'm not going to be shy about saying we need a leader that can reform federal law enforcement in the right way that builds confidence, and not a president that will undermine it and that shows disrespect for our system of justice, whether it's a civil case or a criminal case.
What do you think you can take from your time as governor of Arkansas to make sure that these changes you want are implemented with little headache, both in the executive and legislative branches?
Well, usually they come with a headache, so you got to plow through that, and that's been my experience as governor. You know, as governor, I transformed state government from 42 different departments of government that reported to me down to 15. And I first made my case to the Arkansas voters. So I traveled and held town meetings making my case. You do the similar thing in a campaign for president. You articulate your vision for federal law enforcement reform. That way, when you win, you've got some momentum with the public. And then you've got the legislature. And whenever I got the consensus, we got it into the legislature. And whenever you're passing legislation to change 42 different departments of government, literally the bill was this thick. And the chairman of the committee that considered that legislation, he was not that excited about it. And so he started the hearing, the markup of the bill this way. He said, we're going to be here a while. Let's turn to page 1, line 1. He went through it page by page. So it's sure, you have to build legislative support, public support, but that's what governors do and presidents. You know, in my administration, I want to have cabinet that do a great job of communicating the public message of an administration. But I also want them to manage the department and to watch the administrative state, to make sure that we're acting in accordance with what Congress has dictated and carrying out my mission. These are management issues, and you look at what I did as governor. I managed, I made my case to the public, I defended it, and as a result, we accomplished a lot.
Can you talk a little bit more about your plan for a federal law enforcement commission and how you envision that commission being different than the law enforcement commission that existed under the Trump administration, particularly under Attorney General Bill Barr?
Well, how I see that commission working, and if you look at my time in Arkansas, I utilized task forces, I utilized commissions that were very, very effective. In fact, we had a task force for the, for the transformation of state government. We had business people, we had experts that were engaged in that. We had, we had healthcare task forces during the pandemic. So I really believe in that concept of bringing in experts to manage and make recommendations that are of such a serious nature. I'll be doing the same thing for Social Security and Medicare. I want to have a commission for the future of Social Security and Medicare that looks at long-term fixes, very similar to what President Reagan did in 1982 with Alan Greenspan, that sustained the life of Social Security and Medicare for decades. And so I'm going to utilize that tool. How do I envision this? With those with experience in law enforcement, those that have already studied this issue, there's a lot of work that's been done, and those that are fresh from outside that can take a more distance approach to it. And I want them to look at, first of all, efficiencies. We've got over 90 federal law enforcement agencies. Is there a better model that we can look at? Secondly, we've already accomplished the charters that will provide some standardization between the agencies, but there's always going to be differences in mission. And we're going to look at how they coordinate. Like I said, if you have a meeting on a particular kind of case, you might have 15 different federal law enforcement agencies there. And you have that overseas as well in the country offices and the embassies where you have so many different agencies that are represented. So look at overlap, look at clarity of mission, and make recommendations that we can do things better. And part of that would be the checks and balances and the transparency. So we've, in this transformation plan, laid out some very specific concrete items that we're doing, but we want to take a longer look at it through the commission.
The DEA has not been without its own controversies. Several former agents have been prosecuted in recent years. There have been a number of Inspector General recommendations and reports that have come out that shine not such a positive light on the DEA. Do you believe that that agency needs to be reformed first before you can implement the change of ensuring that all drug offenses are prosecuted by, or investigated by the DEA?
Well, it's a good question. It just shows, we have human systems. We have a human system of justice, and that's why our founding fathers designed checks and balances. And so it's all about the accountability. Now, we're not expanding the mission of the DEA because they already have drug enforcement responsibility. They already have offices in scores of international countries. They already are working closely in Mexico, going after the cartel. They already are part of the organized crime drug enforcement task forces. So they already have the mission. So I don't see any challenge there. You mentioned some of the mistakes that have been made. That's going to happen. That's why we have IGs. That's why we have administrators that makes those corrections. So I'm not saying that they're a perfect agency, but I'm saying that's their fundamental principal mission. And the FBI, it's not theirs. And the FBI has a very important task in counterterrorism and violent crime and supporting local law enforcement investigations and on down the list. But in this one area, let's make sure that we have an exclusive jurisdiction in the DEA and that the FBI can support those efforts as needed.
Before we get to the final question here, Governor, I'd like to just take a moment to thank everyone who helped put this event together, including Headliners co-chairs Donna Linewan-Leger and Lori Russo, the club's Director of Membership, Kate Helster, and Membership and Events and Programs Coordinator, Cecily Scott Martin. I'd also like to just remind you all that the National Press Club will draw attention to Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich's wrongful detention in Russia by publicly reading his stories for a 24-hour period beginning at 8 a.m. this Wednesday, July 19th. And now, Governor, for the final question here, I want to just sharpen on that final point that we just talked about the DEA and the FBI. More than 100,000 people have died of drug overdoses in the U.S. last year, particularly with fentanyl and other synthetic opioids. There's been criticism of the DEA's budget and the number of agents that it currently has. Do you believe that taking away the FBI's role in enforcing drug crimes in the U.S. could lead to additional overdose deaths?
No, just the opposite. We have a more focused mission that will lead that effort, and so we will be more successful in that. And it's a good example that when you're looking at fentanyl, you've got to go after the cartels. You know, the lead in that would be the DEA working with our counterparts in Mexico, coordinating that effort. You've got also the responsibility of Customs and Border Protection. That, you know, I was there at the beginning of that, but the majority of fentanyl is coming through there. It's not being detected by FBI, it's coming through our Customs and Border Protection. Whenever they detect fentanyl, they call the DEA. The DEA then looks to see how we can do a delivery, or we can control delivery to make sure that we can go up the chain and try to get to the organized crime efforts there. And so this should strengthen it. Now there will be, we'll have to look at the resources, because the DEA resources have been very constrained, and partly because we've put such a great emphasis on the counterterrorism efforts in our country. So that has to be looked at and balanced, but let me assure you that this will enhance our capability to go after fentanyl traffickers, and also, it's a critical part of going after the fentanyl is the education in our communities. And when I was with the DEA, we had demand reduction agents that were assigned, that we could go in the communities and have drug awareness. That is very important with fentanyl, because some young person thinks they're buying a Percocet pill on the street, which is wrong and bad and dangerous. But that Percocet pill is likely now to be laced with fentanyl. This is something the DEA does and does well, and they can enhance those efforts, both in education but also in the enforcement side under my plan.
I want to thank you all for being with us today, and thank you, Governor Hutchinson, for joining us and taking so many questions. It's also my honor to present you, sir, with the coveted National Press Club mug.
Here. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Hey, thanks.
Thanks
Great
so much
job.
for doing
Great
that.
job.
Thanks.
Great job.